Alright guys, welcome to Unit 8 and Evolution. So this is going to be a shorter unit than what we've had before. Let's get started with microevolution. So microevolution is when we are talking about a change in the allele frequencies over time for a population. So we have to calculate that frequency. So if we look here, we have 12 green alleles, and we have 8 red alleles. So we're going to say that we have a total of 20 alleles. So what we're going to do is to figure out the current generation for the green allele frequency, we would take that 12 and divide it by the total of 20. So that would give us 0.6, and then of course we'll multiply that by the 100%, and that would be our frequency of 60%. The red allele, same thing, we're going to do the 8 divided by 20, and that equals 0.4, multiply it by the 100%, so we're looking at 40%. So basically, you know what it is currently. Then if you look after 10 generations, it's always going to drop. So basically, it would be, let's say, a change down to 55% here. And 45% here. So you can see it still equals that 100%. It's not always going to be a decrease. It could be an increase as well. So if the allele frequencies change over time, then we say that evolution has occurred. If we looked at the current generation and it was that 60% and the 40%, and after 10 generations we were still at 60 and still at 40, then we would say that evolution has not occurred. So let's look at an example here. So in this image, you have to look at the original population, and you can see that they've counted up all of the different alleles for you and given you the frequency. And then some sort of chance event occurs, and there's now a new population. So you have to look and compare the numbers, and we can see that for the most part, those numbers have changed. So is evolution occurring in this image? Yes. Let's look at a couple other examples. This is something that you might see on the AP exam. So basically, it's looking at the frequency of a certain allele. And this is showing you here the number of generations. So if you look here at this generation, and you look here at this generation, then we can say, yes, evolution has occurred because that number or the frequency has changed. Here, if we start at 2000 and we're at 0.2 and you look across the board, nothing has changed. So here, no, evolution did not occur. And then this image, you can just go through and look by the colors and determine whether or not evolution occurred. You can also look here at the percentages, the numbers. And in this case, yes, evolution has occurred. This image, we start out with our recessive trait, and it starts to decrease, and then increase and decrease again, versus the dominant starts to increase more. So again, yes, evolution occurred there. And then our final image, you can look here, the frequencies. You can see that over the generations, that evolution has occurred. Okay, so we're going to look at 6 different agents or mechanisms, or it could be causes, whatever you want to refer to it as, of evolution of populations. So there are 6 total, and you have to bear with me with this image as I try to write them in. So try to follow along and listen so that we don't lose anything in translation here. So first I'm going to start over here. Artificial selection. That is one cause that we're going to look at. A second one would be sexual selection. A third one would be genetic drift. A fourth one would be gene flow. A fifth one up top would be mutation. And then the sixth one is natural selection. And there are 4 types. And natural selection is important because it is the number 1 cause. So I don't know if you want to highlight it or circle it, whatever you want to do, but there are 4 different types of natural selection. The first one is called stabilizing. The second one is called directional. The third one is referred to as frequency dependent. And the fourth one is disruptive. And we're going to cover all of these. So take a minute and catch up if you're a little bit behind. Okay, so the first one that we're going to look at is mutations. So mutations, basically, they are the ultimate source of new variations. And that, of course, those variations result in new alleles. Artificial selection this is basically when a change in allele frequency is due to humans selecting the traits that are going to become more common over time. So for instance, this shows you corn. And basically, we have selected the traits that make something better over time. Then we have natural selection. And this is basically whenever there's an overproduction and genetic variation occurs. And more or less, the species with the best traits, they're going to survive better and reproduce. Oh, and I forgot here in the middle, we need to change this to agents of evolution. Okay, the next one is sexual selection. And sexual selection is non-mating or selective breeding. So what this means is that when individuals with a certain phenotype mate more than other phenotypes, it's basically going to lead to what is called to sexual dimorphism. And this is when one sex looks different from the other. And here's an example. You can see these phenotypes, and this is what we end up with. Over here, we have gene flow. And gene flow is basically migration of individuals to new populations. And it's going to change the population's allele frequencies. And then we have genetic drift. This is a change in allele frequency due to what is called a chance event. And the chance event to a population is basically going to affect its size. So when there's a chance event and the population has a small size, then it's going to affect basically what's available allele-wise for reproduction. So in this process here, it shows how non-selective it is. Basically, we started out with 3 of these with green, and because of a fire, we end up with now 1. So there are 2 types that you should be familiar with. There's population bottleneck and the founder effects. So down here, this box, this is the big idea that you need to understand. No evolution will occur if there is no mutation. If there's no natural selection, if there's no gene flow, if there's no genetic drift, if there's no artificial selection, no sexual selection, these conditions are hardly ever met. So evolution is constantly happening all the time in different populations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about natural selection. As I said before, it is the main cause of evolution in populations. And this was proposed by Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. So natural selection is going to help lead to adaptations in a population. And those are basically the traits that help the organism survive. And there are 4 principles that must be met in order for natural selection to occur. So the first one is overproduction. So in nature, there's an overproduction of offspring, which means the more that are born, the more can survive, basically. The more likely it is that they will survive, or that there will be a surviving generation. Genetic variation, this is when offsprings are born with variations that are genetic. The third one is struggle for survival. Organisms have to compete for their limited resources. And basically, those with the best traits, they're going to end up out-competing others and be able to survive. And then we have differential reproductive success. Those that survive are going to reproduce, and they will pass on their traits to the next generation, causing those individuals to be more fit. It is important that you understand that fitness is measured by one's ability to pass on genes to the next generation. It is not about how much exercise your squirrel out in the yard gets, okay? And you need to understand that without reproduction, populations would go extinct. But that one's pretty common sense. So, in eukaryotic organisms, variations are going to arise due to crossing over, random fertilization, independent assortment, and mutations. On the other hand, in prokaryotic cells, or prokaryotic organisms, variations are going to arise due to mutations, conjugation, transduction, and transformation. Okay, so let's look at how we can apply this to an AP example. So we've got up here we've got a graph, and it's showing us a solid line of the population that's infected, as well as the dotted line, which is the relative size of the population. And this is a 22-year study. So, the fungal infection that we're talking about, this, I don't even know how to say that, but I'm going to guess it's chytridiomycosis, is basically lethal, and it's going to affect the population of some frogs adversely. The incidence and severity of the fungal infection can vary over time. Which of the following statements best describes the changes in the frog populations that are depicted in the model above? Okay, so A says the fungus that infected the frog population was initially virulent, but it altered to become harmless. Well, we know that's not true because they just told us it was deadly. Let's see. So B says the infected individuals gradually died out and genetically resistant individuals became more common. The frog population recovered because of the increased frequency of resistant individuals. That's a possibility. C, the patterns of the curves on the graph indicate a sudden increase in the severity of the fungal infection. A large proportion of the population died because they could not evolve fast enough. Well, it says sudden, and we know that this is spanning out over a 22 period, so it's not sudden. We're going to get rid of that one. The size of the frog population decreased sharply upon initial contact with the fungus. The fungus eventually became symbiotic with individual frogs, and the frog population began to recover. Well, it's talking about a decrease sharply. Well, when it was here, right, this is when it was introduced into the population that we know of, and the decrease did not happen. It didn't even start to really happen until 5-6 years in somewhere. So, a sharp decrease, not. So I'm going to go with B. So basically, the population increased because of genetically resistant individuals. So let's talk a little bit about the history of natural selection. So Darwin didn't really develop the idea of evolution. He believed that species and populations, they did change over time, and they developed a mechanism to, developed a mechanism to explain this, how it would occur. And the theory of natural selection can also be referred to as descent with modification. There was also another scientist named Lamarck, and near the same time he was developing an explanation, and he called it the theory of acquired characteristics. It is important that you note that, yes, you be familiar with this, but also that you note, let me put it here in red for you, that this, and it didn't work. Hold on. This is not accepted. Okay, so let's compare the two just so that you completely understand what we're looking at here. So Darwin, basically, he had his hypothesis that overproduction is that more individuals are born than can live. So his example would be more giraffes are born than can live in the environment. So that makes sense, right? The environment can only support so many people. His next hypothesis was about genetic variation. Individuals are born with different traits. So the giraffe population is going to show genetic variation, and each giraffe is different from the other. So for example, some will have longer necks than others. His third hypothesis was the struggle for survival. Organisms have to compete to survive on the limited number of resources. So an example of that would be giraffes have to compete with each other for the limited resources to survive, and there are few trees with leaves for giraffes to eat. And the last hypothesis he had was differential reproductive success. Individuals with certain traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. These traits are passed on and become more common in a population. So in our case of giraffes, those giraffes with the longer neck, which is the best trait, they will survive and they will reproduce. And then they're going to pass those genes on for the long neck to a larger population in the next generation. And so those next generations will have longer necks. So all of that pretty much makes sense. Now let's look at Lamarck. So his hypothesis was that individuals have a desire for a trait. So his example was giraffes have a desire or a need to reach the high leaves. So the giraffes are going to use their use their body structures in a specific way to meet that need, and the trait develops. So his example was they reach each day to grab leaves, and as a result, their necks become slightly longer. And then that trait gets passed on to the offspring. And so as a result, the giraffes are able to have offsprings with slightly longer necks. So obviously, we know that that's not correct. So that's why his theory is not widely accepted, or accepted at all for that matter. Okay, so there's 4 types of natural selection we're going to look at. We've got directional, stabilizing, disruptive, and frequency dependent. So if the environment changes, different phenotypes can give an advantage or disadvantage. So those phenotypes that increase the chance of survival are said to be selected for. And they will become more common throughout time. Those phenotypes that decrease the chance of survival are said to be selected against. And they will become less common throughout time. So directional selection is when one extreme phenotype is selected for and the other extreme is selected against. So for example, the European peppered moth, they landed on trees, and they landed on the trunks of the trees. And during the Industrial Revolution, the lichens on the trunks darkened due to the pollution in the atmosphere. So the phenotype that was selected against was what they originally were, which was the white pepper, and they are now darker. So here's our 2 extremes. Here's our against, and this is our for. So if we were to graph that, then we are looking here. The lighter is going to be a smaller amount, and the darker would be a larger amount. Okay, so the next kind is stabilizing selection, or heterozygote advantage. So in this case, when the intermediate phenotype is selected for and both extremes are selected against, this is going to lead to balanced polymorphism as well as the maintenance of 2 alleles in the population. So an example of this is sickle cell anemia in malaria-plagued regions. So heterozygotes are less likely to contract malaria. So in this case, this right here, they're more likely to get malaria. This here, the heterozygote, it is selected for, and here, the complete sickle cell, it is selected against. So if we label those, then we would have, this would be our normal, this would be our intermediate, and this would be our sickle cell. So if we went over here and graphed this, then what's going to happen is you're still going to have some here, you're still going to have some here, but you're going to have a lot more in the intermediate. So disruptive selection is our next type, and this is when both extremes are selected for and the middle phenotype are selected against. And this is going to lead to balanced polymorphism in the population. So for instance, 2 main type of plants exist on an island. One produces large seeds, the other produces small seeds. So we are going to end up with, here we have a bird with a small beak, we have a bird with a medium beak, and a bird with a large beak. So what's going to happen is this intermediate is going to be selected against, and these 2 will be selected for, depending on where they're at on the island, because we have large seeds and we have small seeds. So what's going to happen again is we're going to end up with a large amount of population with smaller, a large amount of population with the large beak, and a small population with the intermediate. Our 4th kind of natural selection is frequency-dependent selection. This is also known as the minority advantage. So when the fitness of a phenotype depends on its frequency, the least common phenotypes have a selective advantage and common phenotypes are selected against. This is again going to lead to that balanced polymorphism in the population, as well as the maintenance of 2 alleles. So, for instance, if we have 2 types of clams, or I just went blank on the name of these. I apologize. So we're just going to call them clams. So if we have 2 types, then this banded, they normally live in the area. Okay? So this is their current population. And there is a boat comes from somewhere and it brings in this new type of unbanded clams. So what's going to happen is that right now, all the fish in the surrounding life in that area, they know to eat the banded because that's what they're used to. So it is being basically selected against because this is what's being eaten. So since it's being eaten, this population decreases. These unbanded are not being eaten, so their population increases. Well, now this will be selected against. So we are going to have a shift, and once again, the populations are going to change. And this can go on for quite some time. Okay, let's talk about natural selection and reproduction rates and evolution rates. So populations with shorter generation times and those that can produce more offspring have a faster rate of evolution through natural selection than those populations that have longer generation times, producing fewer offspring. So if you compare an elephant to a bacteria, let's say hypothetically that it takes 10,000 generations to see any significant change in a population, that can be accomplished in 5 months for bacteria. So those animals with low reproductive rates and long generation times, they're going to be very slow to evolve. So for instance, if you compare these, polar bears, they reproduce every 3 years. Orangutans every 6 to 8 years, elephants every 4 to 5 years, cheetahs every 18 months, pandas every 2 years. So it takes a much longer time for evolution to occur, especially if you're talking about hypothetically 10,000 generations. Versus those organisms with a high reproductive rate and a short generation time, these are going to evolve very quickly. For instance, bacteria, the reason why I said that could take 5 months for bacteria is that they can actually reproduce every 20 minutes. Cats, sometimes they can have 12 offspring in a year. Rabbits, they can have a litter every month. So they can evolve very, very quickly. So let's talk about environmental change because that can affect natural selection as well. So if a change is considered gradual, populations can evolve over time through that natural selection. But when the change is abrupt, populations are going to drop because individuals will die. So, for instance, let's apply what we just learned. Flash floods wash large amounts of topsoil into a stream that was initially clear. Salamanders in the stream used keen eyesight to spot prey. What will likely happen to the salamander population due to this event? So the first thing you have to decide, is this gradual or is it abrupt? And considering that it's flash floods, we're going to say that it's abrupt. So A, they will adapt to sea and muddy water. Well, probably not because it was super abrupt. The populations of salamander will drop, likely. Salamanders will move to a new habitat in which they can see their predator. I doubt that they'll have time to move. And they will switch to a new food source that's easier to catch. That's also doubtful unless they move. So we're going to go with B. The populations will drop because they cannot see to get their prey. Okay, so let's talk about natural selection and adaptations. Traits that arise due to natural selection are called adaptations. It's important that you understand that adaptations, they can either be features, they can be behaviors, or they can be abilities. And all of these adaptations, they are occurring so that they can increase the fitness of the organism or increase their chance of survival and reproduction. So, for example, seals have 3 times the amount of hemoglobin of other mammals, to carry more oxygen. So, if you look at these different kinds of seals, this is their dive duration, and this is their positive blood lactate. So you can see here that these seals, the Weddell seals, they can dive and stay under longer because they have so much more hemoglobin. They can carry more oxygen. Another example is the Viceroy butterfly. It's non-poisonous, and it looks identical to monarchs, which are poisonous. And this is called Batesian mimicry. And you can see this here, this is a monarch. And it's poisonous when birds eat it, versus here, this is the Viceroy. So think about if you were a bird and you're flying along, are you really going to question which one's which? So, mimicry is a great thing for the Viceroy. So, natural selection of bacteria. Here are a couple do nots. Do not say when exposed to the antibiotic, the bacterial cell became immune to the antibiotic. Bacteria do not have immune systems. Also, do not say some bacteria are able to fight off the antibiotic and become resistant to it. That doesn't happen. So how would you approach natural selection with bacteria? You would say bacteria have variations due to transduction, transformation, conjugation, or because of mutations. Some variations might allow some bacteria to become resistant to antibiotics. These individuals survive and reproduce, leading to populations in which all bacteria are resistant. So there's just a couple of things to remember about bacteria. Also keep in mind that the genetic variant must be present before the introduction of the antibiotic in order to see the development of a resistant strain. So if you look here, all of these yellows, we've only got 2 resistant bacteria. Antibiotics come in, do their thing, and it's going to wipe out the majority of those bacteria. But again, we had the resistant, so that is where they are going to replicate and become a problem. Okay, natural selection and variation. It's important to know that natural selection would not occur unless populations show variation. Variations are going to arise, and they are maintained due to many reasons in both types of cells, eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So let's look at those. So the process is needed to introduce or maintain variation. We've already looked at these. Eukaryotic, we've got the independent assortment of chromosomes during meiosis. We also have random fertilization. That's going to increase variation. We have crossing over during prophase 1 of meiosis. That's going to increase the number of different gametes each of us can make. We also have mutations, which lead to new alleles in a population. And in prokaryotic cells, we have transduction, which is acquiring the new alleles due to the transfer of DNA. Transformation, which is acquiring of extracellular DNA. And conjugation, which is copying and transfer of plasmids from one bacteria to the next. Some new mechanisms that lead to or help maintain variation, as well as balanced polymorphism in different populations. So first, balanced polymorphism means that two or more alleles are being maintained in the population. So the variation is being maintained. Why do you think lethal alleles are not eliminated from the population? Something to ponder. So the eukaryotic, in those cells, the diploid number maintains variations in the population. Organisms that are diploid, they have a recessive allele usually, sometimes harmful, and they can pass them on to the next generation. So diploidy ensures, or you could also say diploidy, ensures that recessive alleles will never be eliminated in a population. It also ensures that balanced polymorphism will occur. In eukaryotic cells, we also have what is referred to as the heterozygote advantage. So in stabilizing selection, the heterozygote has a phenotype that is selected for or advantageous. Those individuals that survive can pass on either one of their alleles, either the dominant or the recessive. So that ensures that both of them will continue to be present in a population, causing balanced polymorphism to occur. Also in eukaryotic, we have what is called outbreeding. And this is the mating of unrelated organisms, and that's going to ensure that rare alleles will continue to be present. And finally, there is frequency dependent selection, also referred to as the minority advantage. And this is when the least common phenotypes have a selective advantage and the common phenotypes are selected against. And that will again lead to balanced polymorphism in the population. So to end it, let's do one more question. Salamanders in a population show spots on their backs while others are not spotted, which is a recessive trait. Which of the following is least likely to contribute to the maintenance of these different phenotypes referred to as balanced polymorphism? Okay. Least likely. So the recessive phenotype is lethal, while the heterozygote shows the dominant phenotype. Salamanders are diploid organisms, meaning two alleles contribute. Yes, we know that's true. The recessive phenotype has a selective advantage. The absence of spots is due to a common mutation that occurs in populations. Well, a lot of them are good. I'm going to say B. So,